Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar. This is in climate outreach in collaboration with Green Alliance. As we know, 2025 will be a defining year for UK's climate ambitions and the UK's climate conversation. We know people across the country care about tackling climate change. We know that from our research that we do regularly. And we see that the people are seeing effects of a challenging and changing climate all around them. But what happens next is a task like no other. We need to get emissions down across the whole of society, including our energy, transport, food sectors, and we need to prepare for the impacts of a climate that is already changing. So, the work that we're very, very pleased to share with you today is a report which is our first attempt to help navigate this challenging and fast changing landscape. We interviewed 20 climate and nature experts to ask them what are the most mission critical, real world UK communications and engagement tasks on climate, clean energy, nature, over this climate, and who needs to do them and how. So, with that introduction, I'm super happy to introduce the excellent speakers and panel today. So, we have Rachel Orr, CEO at Climate Outreach. Then we'll also hear from Chris Venables, Director of Politics at Green Alliance. And then we'll have a presentation from Chris Pollard, researcher at Climate Outreach. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Rachel to share her remarks and start this brilliant webinar. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nameerah, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining, and thank you for your interest in what we think is a really critical piece of work. Only 6 months ago, just over 6 months ago, we elected the greenest parliament ever. Labour won a landslide on a platform of ambitious climate action and supercharging clean energy. Polling conducted after the election has found that Labour's ambition on climate won them votes. We know it to be true because it was in the Daily Mail. So the first thing I really want to say is I think we would all do really well to remember this. I think we are seeing at the moment that opponents of ambitious climate action are mobilising sometimes more effectively than its supporters. And it would be very easy for us to be dragged into their doom loop. And that is one of the reasons why we wanted to undertake the research and produce the report that we are presenting today. As Nameerah had said, we were pretty sure that this year would be vital for climate policy and for the climate story. And with every day of 2025 that goes past, I think I feel that we kind of underestimated just how important it would be. For those of you who know climate outreach and who might have followed our work over the years, you will know that we have often talked about how important it is that we create a strong social mandate for climate action right across society, that people think and feel that climate action is essential. It's something that they can be involved in, and it's an important part of who they are. I think we've made huge strides in doing this. As Nameerah said, 4 in 5 of us in the UK say we care about climate change and protecting nature, and 2/3 of people want the government to press ahead or go at the same pace in the race to net zero. But I think the job we have to do in 2025 is to protect this mandate, because there is a risk that it's going to weaken before us. I think we knew this bit would be really hard. These are the years when the bits about the green transition that we know are so critical are affecting people's everyday lives, the way we travel, the food we eat, our workplaces, our communities. And if we don't get the story and the narratives and the engagement with people right, then we're going to find that even more challenging. So I think the reflections that you're going to hear in this report of the 20 experts we spoke to give us a sense of what we need to do. You'll hear about the need for bold collaborations, about a shared story that speak of progress that we've won, about needing to show the green transition as the economic opportunity of the century, and most of all about getting real people and real stories at the centre. So we hope this report helps set out for you some of the challenges with the climate story this year, but also what we see as the opportunities. And we'd like to really invite you all to join with us in telling it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Just as a reminder, we have not opened the chat thread, but we do have the Q&A open as an option. So please do keep putting in your questions as we go along this webinar. Right, so Chris Pollard, can I turn to you to present sort of our findings from the research? And then after that, we'll go over to Chris Venables. Thank you.
Thanks, Nameerah. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Pollard. I'm a senior researcher at Climate Outreach, and we did this bit of work in conjunction with Green Alliance before Christmas. So I've just got a few slides here. I'm going to tell you what we did, what we found, and then what we think. So this project was all about now. So the question, when we got these experts together, we were really lucky to work with Chris and others throughout our networks to identify these key thinkers across the UK. And these are the questions that we're interested in asking right now. So over the next 5 years, what's the most important climate, clean energy and or nature engagement and communication job in the UK? And why is it the most important? And then key ones as well is, how do you think this job should be done and who needs to be involved? The interviews that we did with the experts were in November 2024 across a wide range of policy, journalism, campaigns and research. And the interviews were really short, only half an hour. So we couldn't go into a lot of depth that people like to go into. We wanted it to be succinct and say, okay, what is the thing that's right, the priority now that you can think above other things, which limited the conversation, but was really interested in bubbling the important things to the top. Then for this report and the analysis, we synthesized the key themes across the conversations that we had across those questions, and we'll discuss some of those now. So I should just acknowledge again Green Alliance and Chris and the names of the experts there who we were lucky enough to speak to for this project. Okay, themes. What needs doing? So there's three slides here, three key themes that emerged from the discussions that we had. This is the first one, and it's about getting the benefits across. So picked out a couple of quotes from the experts that we had for each of the themes to illustrate what we're talking about. So here it's, I don't think enough people understand the imperative of more pylons and more clean energy. Why are communities going to be asked to host some of that, and what's in it for them? What's the direct benefit that they get? So this is about a key priority being that we need to be better at communicating why the transition is needed. We need to be honest about those costs and be transparent about it. Other people are going to be talking about the costs, so we need to actually own that and say what the costs are, both financially and culturally and societally. And then, but also be positive and communicate what the excitement and dynamism of the transition can mean. What are the opportunities to solve problems that we already see in the current state, so that things can change for the better. The second theme was about building trust. This came up a lot. When it comes to communicating some of these areas of demand, maybe it's like citizens' advice or community groups or anybody who is actually directly engaging with the public day to day. They're particularly trusted and be able to tailor the messaging, but support people who are maybe particularly affected by cost of living or might be motivated by different things. So that's being able to get the people who are find those trusted voices and show that the plans, the mission, they're good, they will work, build those trust in the plans themselves, then find better messengers. What's the trust in the actual messengers themselves? And then choose messaging or develop messaging that actually speaks to people's real lives. So that's the trust in the plans, there's trust in the messengers, and the trust in the message itself. A lot of work that we've done of climate outreach around trust last year showed that three key elements in trusted messages. We describe about having empathy, having credibility, and having passion. And those three things can be applied to these three areas as well. The final theme that came out was about giving people a meaningful say. There needs to be a sense of consultation, proper consultation, not just tick box exercise, but a process where communities feel they have a voice in the process and that they've been properly consulted. And the second thing is that they also feel ownership of these projects as well. So this is, I think this is at the forefront of everybody's minds as well, around new green energy infrastructure in the UK and planning regulations as well. So people were talking about that infrastructure plans should be done with people and not to people. And also making sure that people were mechanisms that people were involved in those policy decisions and how those choices are actually made. Okay, so we had the what, we had the talking about benefits and co-benefits, we had building trust, and we had including people more. This section is more about the how and the who. So this is the sort of the meat of it. And we've got three themes that came out here. Number one is around listening to those skeptical audiences. So how do we, if we're thinking about talking about benefits, if we're thinking about building trust and including people, we need to think about skeptical audiences and wider audiences when we're thinking about what benefits do we actually talk about, for example. Here, our expert said, is the consensus for environmental action under attack? And then if it is, what, if anything, can be done to sort of shore it up? My instinct is I wouldn't move to sort of new activities until we're relatively clear about what the current state of play is. Let's not sort of abandon our sense that the public is generally on our side before we're absolutely certain that the public isn't generally on our side. So when we're thinking about that, it's broadening the engagement. That might mean having more uncomfortable conversations with people who are more skeptical and going, how do we prepare ourselves to go and have those conversations? Understanding who the opponents are talking to and why their arguments are working. So not necessarily just thinking about here's the kind of here's the output from opponents and how do we counter that, but why are they saying that? Why does that work with the audiences more generally, and going to the audiences and not just reacting completely to the what opponents might be saying. Getting better insight and tracking on what people think. So the quote there, for example, is making sure that we really understand the point of view of different publics and making sure we're on top of that and tracking it consistently and with good insight and knowledge. And finally, trusted voices. So this could be finding people who don't already talk about climate, who are relevant to certain skeptical audiences, and helping them tell their climate story. Or it might be that we look at ourselves in the climate sector or the climate movement, say, how are we going to become better communicators ourselves and more trusted communicators with the audiences that we really want to speak to. So secondly, around the how, is changing that story. What are we actually going to be speaking about? So, for pylons, I think this is the trickiest, because from what I understand it, there's a route the pylons need to go down. You can alter it, you can move it a couple of fields left, but you can't do a lot more. This is it. And therefore, you only have the debate about how that's done and how local people are included, how they potentially benefit, whether that's through some kind of ownership model or cheaper bills or whatever. But if those things are on the table, then you can have that conversation with people. So this is about leading messaging with things that are salient to people's everyday lives, the real benefits, not the abstract promises of loads of green jobs in the future. That might be great for a certain audience, but for everyday lives, that's not really, we know that doesn't work. We need to consistently counter the idea that people don't care about the environment and don't care about climate change. We know that people do. But we also know that people are constantly saying that people don't care about it and that people are selfish and not willing to act on climate themselves. We know that that's not true. People do care. Let's counter that idea. And again, looking at those diverse messengers, so that they can tell their story representative of a wider range of people and a wider range of stories that climate action is really telling. So finally, around the how, we're looking at better coalitions. This is something that a lot of our experts talked about. Be really clear about the changes we want to see and collaborate on that. So we have central government, regional government, businesses, NGOs, all aligned on how we want to take it forward. And then clarity about the roles that those different stakeholders play in delivering it, and have it all together as a strategy. So this is creating broader and more network coalitions, denser networks or different shaped networks. We might have dense networks where there's lots of communication and lots of collaboration to think through knotty problems, but also networks that might be really sparse so information can pass really quickly to exactly where it needs without being held up. And secondly, people talked about having a game plan that unifies. So not necessarily being very specifically all aligned all the time, but a wider plan that everybody can understand. So even if you're not right in the center of these thick policy networks or research networks, that you can still follow along with everybody else and work together without being all the time spent with closer relationships. Okay, so that's the first couple of sections where we're just reflecting on what people were saying and describing what people were saying with those quotes. This next little bit is more about how we feel, what we're kind of bringing out of it and what our analysis is. Now, I've got four, we've called them dichotomies here, or false dichotomies. There were a lot of the things that I've already presented were where people agreed. There were places where people necessarily disagreed. And like I said, with the way that we did the interviews, we were very specific and we didn't have much time to go into lots of nuance and be really pragmatic. We were forcing people to pick a side, basically. So that a lot of these dichotomies, our experts wouldn't necessarily be in one camp or the other, but it really helps, I think, that we got diverging views in some areas, and it's nice to sort of look at that and think through what that actually means. So the first of our dichotomies, or false dichotomies, is about being more unified or more diversified. So in terms of being more unified, do we increase message discipline, for example, position climate action squarely as a response to cost of living and all pull in that direction? Or do we go more diversified? And diverse messaging means that more stories to connect with people's lives. And from a climate outreach point of view, thinking about one or the other, we think that there are definitely core messages that we can all use. So we know from our research that things like in the UK anyway, responsibility, pragmatic action, protecting nature and our families, and energy security, these work really well across the board with a broad range of people. But what about the diversification part? Well, that comes when you're talking about the stories. So when you might have responsibility as a theme, but the actual stories you tell about responsibility, they're the things where you start to be more specialized into people's lives. The second dichotomy is around speed and how you talk about the speed of what needs to be done and how you actually work. Slow engagement with early, ongoing, continuous engagement with communities, or is it about comms for speed? We know that it's really urgent. Do we focus on persuading people about the urgency of action? From our point of view, and I hope that a lot of our experts, if we'd gone into this in more detail, may agree that at the kind of macro scale, at the movement scale, there is no trade-off between the patient engagement with those skeptical audiences or raw audiences and having impactful comms for support of swift action. You need both to be happening at the same time. But when you need to choose about the difference, that's at the messaging, the organisation, at maybe the campaign scale, where it needs to be one or the other. But I think an appreciation is that everyone should have, from our point of view, is that if you fail to set out the compelling vision, then or don't pick the right speed or level of engagement, then the progress might be much slower than it should be as people push back and don't feel included. The third one is whether we keep climate messaging or talk about more about co-benefits. This was a really interesting split actually within our experts. So from a climate messaging point of view, do we not abandon and risk that loss of salience? People get it, people care, people know about climate change, they want to see action. Do we continue to support that and really push that as the climate messaging? Or do we switch over and talk more about those co-benefits? We know that this high, the salience of climate is high, but it's not necessarily been high enough to persuade people to change or take actions in the way that we might necessarily have been asking or want them to. So this is talking about meeting people what is salient in their lives at the moment. How do we square that circle? This is the tough one. We know that people do care about climate and nature. All our research has shown that, but that the stories around climate and nature don't always connect to their lives. So keeping that climate messaging and making sure it is included, and we talk about climate and we talk about how things benefit nature, but maybe a second or third priority message. We don't lead with this is something about a climate action. It just is second or third on that list. So finally, and this is a really big one of now, I think, it's about fighting polarization or facing the battle and leaning in. So do we cherish the legacy of the broad cross-party and cultural agreement, which might be wavering, as Rachel mentioned at the top? Or do we pick our side and lean into battling for the tribes that we think that we can engage more and motivate them to take even greater action? From a climate outreach point of view, we've always been on the more on the side of fighting that polarization and trying to proactively avoid talking about polarization. We know from our research that there's much more that unites people than divides people in this country, especially around climate. And knowing that an apparent win in the short term over an enemy in a battle may sow the seeds of backlash and division for the future. So finally, this is the final section about recommendations. Now, as a researcher, I come from a biodiversity and conservation social science background. So I've spent a lot of my career talking to ecologists. So I've stolen this actually from this tagline from descriptions of what makes a thriving ecological network: bigger, better, more joined up. And I think that's really relevant to how to make a strong movement and what we want to talk about. So what do I mean by bigger, better, and more joined up from this context? Bigger is listening to and including people from the new audiences, underrepresented impact, and those skeptical groups that we're talking about, and meeting them where they are, broadening who is involved and who we're speaking to and who we're trying to engage with. What does better look like? Well, not presenting climate and nature as fundamental trade-offs, either to each other or to other things that are really important in people's lives. Finding ways to speak to an anxious public and to anxious policymakers, perhaps, about building a better world. And being better is being alert to responsive to new harmful narratives and avoiding divisive language where we know that pushes people apart. In terms of more joined up, that's about collaboration and cooperation. Broad cross-sectoral coalitions across many different areas of society is where we need to be going. And not only working in those kinds of networks, but telling stories of people working together towards that common goal. This is my final slide. So just to reiterate how public engagement is really central to what we do at Climate Outreach and is really central to the challenges that the government and the movement are facing at the moment. But it's great news. The government announced doing a public engagement strategy in 2025. So that's really good news. That's coming up. And the kind of questions that we're thinking about at Climate Outreach now and others that we're working with is what this should look like. What's the urgency around it? What are those timelines? That's really, really key for what comes out of central government. We need to be thinking about what the story of the transition is, who's winning, who's losing, why, and it's being contested as well. We can't be complacent about those kinds of conversations, and we need to be on top of the challenges to it. The politics of governing this transition are about how people feel about what's happening to them. If people think that climate action's out to get them, and it isn't just because the people are telling them that they're the case. We need to go and listen to people and actually hear why they think that they're supportive or not of the transition. And of course, remembering that all communications are public engagement. being considerate and caring about what kind of stories audience wants to hear and who the messengers are. That's the way to create a good relationship with audiences and move forward. So thanks very much for listening. I'll pass back to Nameerah.
Thank you so much. I see that lots of questions are trickling in the Q&A box, so keep that coming because we'll get to those questions very soon. But before we do that, Chris Venables, can I turn to you for your remarks, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Nameerah, and thanks, Chris. I won't speak very long because I'd love to listen to all the questions and have chance to do those over. But a few things, I guess, just first to say it's a really hard moment. Like, I've been working on this stuff quite a long time, and definitely feels like the politics feels as messy, as contested, as tricky as it's ever done. And therefore, particular thanks to the team at Climate Outreach for this piece of work and for the leadership you're showing in trying to help us navigate what is a complex and difficult comm space. I won't rehash anything that Chris ran through. I feel like that's actually a really sort of clear set of principles and kind of visions. I suppose all I'd say is that we know the job at hand, which is to win the conversation in the public. You know, we have to win this conversation on climate somehow, and keep winning it, as the Conservatives look likely to attack the Climate Change Act to kind of row back and break what has been a long-held consensus. So I think in order to do that, it's clear we need a really kind of, you know, compelling vision that we can all get behind. We need to mobilize all those different groups, MPs, businesses, etc., behind that agenda. And above all, be confident maybe that we're right, that the public are behind us, that our stuff is good, and we are in the kind of, as Ed Miliband says, the better lives business. So I think then a challenge for us is really how we do that. As organisations and how we work together, and as I was thinking about that challenge, which is really live for me, for us at Green Alliance, I went back to a blog that Kirsty McNeil, who used to be the director of Advocacy at Save the Children, wrote in 2021. She's now in government. But she said we need everyone in the movement and in the sector to act like trustees of the movement. And we need people to do the things that are in everyone's interests, but in no one's job description. And I think that means lifting our heads up, you know, beyond our specific campaigns, beyond our specific projects, and thinking, what does this kind of moment mean for us as a community? How can I show up for the broader sector, you know, beyond any specific project and piece of work? So I'm thinking about Kirsty's advice there and challenge. I was also thinking about advice and a challenge from Sophie Jenkinson, who's the co-director of Round Our Way. And she recently said to me, we all need to say really good things about other people's work when they're not in the room. And I really think that's true. There are just so many brilliant people doing such incredible work. And as Chris said, it's that ecosystem that we need. So how are we really championing the work of different organisations and of people across the sector when we know that we need them to win if we're going to win? So I think, and then finally, as I've been grappling with the last few weeks, and Heathrow and Rosebank, and I saw a question on that, and we can no doubt chew that over. Obviously, dragging oneself out of bed in the morning sometimes can feel a bit tricky. And I was also thinking about this lovely piece of writing that I always come back to from Clarissa Pinkola, who and lots of you may know this, but she says, when a great ship is in harbour and moored, it is safe, there can be no doubt, but it's not what great ships are built for. And I often think of our movement and our sector as a great ship. There are so many of us in different places doing amazing things. And I think this moment for me is about how we come together, how we kind of take those insights that the team Climate Outreach pulled together. And I think the question, I suppose, to grapple with and that we all need to grapple with is sort of how we do that well. But yeah, thanks Nameerah, thanks Chris for the sort of the work, and I'll stop there, but happy to answer any questions on the politics. I should have added a caveat at the start that I'm a politico, not a comms expert. So I can talk to the ins and outs of who's up, who's down in the corridors of power, less on less on the kind of comms stuff. So yeah, thanks, Nameerah.
Thank you so much. No, you mentioned the right question, the question that I was looking at as well. It's such a punchy question, and it's so important, right? Like, there's that big picture strategic question for our entire sector. How many decisions like Rosebank can we take while still supporting the good climate stuff that the government is doing on clean power by 2030, ambitious NDCs, etc. And so, different organizations within our own sector will have different views, and we have to respect that. But there is that need to work on all of this together, have a coherent approach as a sector. So a question for both of you, Chris, whichever one of you wants to go first, sort of about this need for our sector to be working together with a joined up approach, if you have anything more to say on that.
Yeah, happy to jump in on the Rosebank, Heathrow, all the bad stuff question. I mean, the first thing to say is none of that is a done deal. So what the Chancellor announced in her speech was an indication of support for a planning application from Heathrow, kind of when it comes. The two planning applications for Luton and Gatwick are still with the Secretary of State for Transport, and the Lower Thames Crossing, which was approved, which she indicated support for, still needs private finance. So I think sometimes I would take a beat in some of the media coverage, and sometimes I think people want us to feel like it's a done deal. I think there's a strategy coming from parts of government that want the movement and the sector and the public and Westminster to think that the decisions are done. They're not. Like, none of them are done. Like, we can still win the conversation. We still have to show up. So that's my first point. And obviously, this is, the Rosebank is a quasi-legal process. Equinor have to resubmit a development consent. On Drax specifically, I was a little bit heartened by that decision. I think you could read that as a bit of a death knell for the subsidies for Drax. Very disappointing, obviously, that went ahead, but in the details. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that there is still an ambitious agenda, and there are people at the heart of government fighting hard for that. We've got the Warm Homes Plan this year. We've got the Clean Power Plan, and our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to bolster those forces of good in Parliament, in government, and obviously, in large part, that is about a massive narrative shift that has to take place, and us waking up to the reality we're in, which is that the Mail, the Telegraph, Reform UK, and others want to tell a story that this stuff is expensive, difficult, challenging, bad for you. And I think there's a feeling amongst many of us that we've forgotten to tell the simple story. One, that climate change is happening, it's real, it's now, and we have to talk about it. And two, we think this stuff is good for us. And so, yeah, I suppose I think those would be my 2 points. One, refuse the doom loop. I think that parts of the press and parts of our political establishment sort of want to push us into, and to remember that we are fighting for some really good things that could make people's lives better, like quite soon, and we can't lose sight of those things. But obviously that's not to be naive around what this government's agenda is, and the fact that there are some people who are not seized of the climate agenda in the same way we are.
Yeah, I think that you asked in your question, Nameerah, about being more joined up and how we can do that as well. And I think 2 points really across these questions. First one is that we know that the government has the public engagement plan that they're planning for this year. And I think that is something that can be a focus for how we are joined up when thinking about how central government plays their role. So how are organisations working in this space able to look at and develop that public engagement plan, but also how to work alongside it once it comes into action, or whatever it looks like, to be able to take that as a plan for everybody be able to look to and use that themselves in their own public engagement. But the second thing, and this comes a bit to the question in the Q&A as well, that Chris was talking about, is that not everything is central government. So we asked the questions and framed it of our experts that over the next 5 years, over the next course of the next government, but not necessarily saying specifically the central government. So of course the central government have these really big decisions and really big responsibility, and what they say has impact and trickles down for everyone. But there's also a massive, using the ecosystem analogy again, of other organisations and places where people have conversations about climate and take action as well. So, you know, speaking a little bit to the folks in the Q&A about how, you know, feeling a bit despondent about things that might be coming out of central government and how do you react to that? It's those other conversations that you have outside of that as well, and remembering the strength of community action and the strength of what businesses are trying to do, and individuals, as well as how we can use our engagement strategies to uplift those great stories that are happening, maybe in the face of other challenges.
Thank you so much. There's one question about language that I'm instinctually sort of very interested in. So the question from Craig is about, you know, he's saying that currently a lot of language around climate change is white, middle class oriented, when in fact terms like climate mitigation and adaptation are turned off to certain people, and da-da-da. I know that we've done a lot of work on language at Climate Outreach as well. So Crispy, I'll give this over to you in a bit. But, you know, like from what we see in our research, we do see the same sort of message that we don't need to be using technical language to talk to people. We don't need to be using sort of net zero or words like emissions, when all we mean is cleaner air, warmer homes, sort of cleaner food and all of that. So as much as we can, using words that, you know, feel like we're humans and we're talking to humans. So Chris, if you have more to add to this, I think that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. So a good example of that, I think you're alluding to, Nameerah, is from our BTC work, our Britain Talks Climate Survey, where we did some testing on what people understood better or more supported. Was it net zero? Was it reducing our emissions, or was it balancing? And when we did that with a split sample, talking about balancing emissions came out as something that people felt more positively about. So that's just one tiny example of the way that looking at these different, of how language might impact what people think about. But I think it talks a lot to this question, talks a lot to going to people and speaking to them where they are. If you're talking to people about how climate change might impact their lives, or about what's really, really important to them, the way people describe what's important to them and the things and how climate change impacts them is the kind of language that you can that you should use when you're telling those stories. Even better when it's coming from people themselves who are living that and speaking their own truth and speaking their own voices there. So from a climate outreach point of view, something that we champion a lot is not just guessing what we think might work, but actually testing it. So you can do a lot of research and say this kind of language is going to appeal to this group of people. Brilliant, that's great theory. We spend a lot of time actually going to testing these. So to be able to understand what kind of language actually chimes with people and what turns them off, because you might not know exactly what's coming out somebody's mind when you say something to them. So there's that understanding it's that two sides of the coin of public engagement. It's the audience, who's the audience, what are they thinking, what do they really care about, how can you go and talk to them, and then it's looking at yourself and how you're speaking and what you're using in order to be able to create that really good connection.
And similar to this question is also the work that we've done on sort of how should scientists communicate. Chris, if you want to just add a little bit more on the same, there's one question, sort of they're asking how should scientists communicate if there aren't that many sort of progresses in a technical way, what's the best way for them to communicate?
So when we're looking at, like you've said there, is, putting up loads of graphs and talking in really jargon heavy and technical language. Yeah, don't do that unless you're speaking to another scientific audience. But it's about, from our trust work that I mentioned in the presentation, being a trusted messenger so people can actually people actually listen to you. That's showing the empathy and the credibility and the passion, and saying why you care about it and why it impacts you and why you work on it. If you're a scientist, why you work on this area and why you think it's really important, and the kind of impact it has on you personally, and telling that personal story. You're already if you're a sort of climate scientist and you really understand the science, then you're way ahead in terms of credibility in some areas. But being able to connect with people and say on a very human level why you're interested in this and why you work on it is a great way to communicate. So you can think of an analogy, if there's a medical analogy, if you're thinking about talking to somebody about the importance of cancer research or something like that. If you're telling a story about your personal relationship with someone that you love, or something, how cancer might have impacted your life, that's a really obvious way of being able to connect the kind of medical clean part of the argument, of the connection, and make it more real. And that's the same thing that we say to lots of climate scientists that when we're doing training for that.
Thank you. Back to a more sort of politics related question. There's one about, it's easy to fall into the trap of blaming, right-wing parties when there's a lot of need for accountability for the current government. I know, Chris Venables, you've said something about this, or quite a lot about this already, but if you have any more thoughts, if you'd like to add more.
Yeah, thanks, Nameerah. And I'll just touch briefly on those other points as well, if that's okay. Just on language, I was really struck recently by something that Hameed, who's the director of messaging at Neon, shared, which is that our opposition, and let's be honest, that there is an opposition, and while we're sitting on a Zoom call working out how to communicate well, there's other people sitting in other rooms on Zoom calls working out how to disrupt us and slow us down. They're really good at making this urgent. So they talk about today, they talk about making people's lives better now, they talk about, or indeed the cost of net zero now, they talk about, they make things feel urgent and live. And they're also quite good at sort of storytelling around heroes and villains. So like, we're the villains, for example, and they're the heroes. So reform are the heroes, and the climate movement is the villain. So I think there's something for us around becoming more active, like in our communications. But I think also, just to say, and Green Alliance struggles with this. I know that lots of our partners and networks do. If it's the case that the public mandate is weakening for climate action, and there's evidence to suggest that's true, then our job suddenly becomes less to persuade the government to do things and more to shore up the public mandate. And I think that's a really sort of existential question for lots of environmental groups who, and I include us in this, are quite used to quite a default way of operating, which is we run a campaign at the government to do policy thing X and we construct something around that. I think it's a big shift for us to be like, oh, as a sector and a movement, we have this other job to do. So I think that's sort of like a big shift as well. And the reason I say that is just on that last question. I think I've not seen anyone in the environmental movement giving this government a free ride. I think the reactions around Heathrow, Rosebank, and the briefings around Rosebank were pretty unequivocally damning of those decisions. I think the question is, how are we effective in telling a different story? And I think I was like such a privilege to be part of a group of organizations working on Heathrow for 3 weeks, because we told a better story, we challenged their arguments on growth, and we refused to buy into the idea that it was a done deal and that we as actors in this space don't have agency. So I think that's a sort of interesting thing there. On just coming back to that first question, I feel like I missed a nugget in it, which I just want to come back to, which was around sort of like hope, agency, despair. I think like my basic feeling around that is that whilst I find it hard sometimes to show up and keep coming to work, and it's like, oh, it's another day in this kind of burning bin fire that is climate politics. Basically, what everyone has already said in the comments is like people are really struggling in their day-to-day lives to, like, you know, put food on the table, heat their homes. And I think we all think that our stuff is going to make our country a better place and like help those people. And whilst Chris was right in the presentation that we should be honest around the trade-offs, we can make those work, like if we get this right. And so I think I always come back to that in a way, like, yes, for me as a campaigner or environmentalist, it can be somewhat sort of like a drudge, but it's not really comparable to like the lived reality of people in this country who are experiencing poverty or on the front lines. Those things are like, I'm on their side. So I think the sort of interesting thing around also as a sector, as a movement, how we get a bit better about being confident around the fact that we are and that we do have a good story to tell. Sorry, Nameerah, I think that was a slight side point, but just wanted to make it.
No, love it. Thank you. There's a related question, Chris P, about sort of, are there any good examples of how the sector listens to skeptical voices and how can this be done in practice? And I thought some of the work from our Britain Talks Climate and sort of the segmentation and how to speak to those on the sort of more right part of the spectrum. I think I should give it over to you before my voice goes out, but I think that would be a very interesting one to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. How do you reach people who are disengaged, for example? So I think the Britain Talks Climate work we've done makes a really good first step, because it allows you to understand a bit better who who disengaged folk might actually be, and see where they are and what makes them tick, or why, a set of things that might say, why do you think these folks are disengaged? And then when you're asking questions about climate, you can understand how they feel about it. Now, in a lot of cases where the folk that we might turn disengaged, and many of the answers to surveys and focus groups it's a bit more distant in terms of, really strong feelings about something. There's fewer strong feelings, and that's maybe why there's that disengagement, why they're defined in that way. But that's the first step to being able to understand that. The second thing is that there are lots of organizations and community groups and networks out there who are already working in many different areas, who are not necessarily climate focused organizations. They may well be on the same page in terms of climate action, but they're not a climate organization. But they're the organizations that we need to be speaking to and working with. So instead of trying to directly go and speak to a specific group, there are people who work with them and who work with different groups all the time. And really being, talking again about those network of organizations, not just environmental organizations, environmental NGOs or climate organizations. It's wider than that, and being able to say, how can someone a small organization who talks about, for example, housing in inner city Birmingham, how can they talk about climate with the people that they work with every day? Because climate is going to impact everybody, it already is, and actions taken to try and mitigate or adapt to climate are going to impact those folks. It's the conversations that are going to be happening anyway. How do we work with those organizations to make sure they're having really good, impactful conversations? Thank
you. I'm trying to choose one set of last questions to ask each of you, and I'm sort of struggling between there are a couple of questions about the negative influence of the new US administration. Chris, if you want to take that. But I do want to end on a hopeful, positive note, because that's the message that we're trying to give away today. So if you want to take the US administration question first, and then your last remarks back on hope.
Yeah, look, I mean, absolutely, like, no doubt that the Trump administration is impacting the conversation in the UK. Like the government is nervous around tariffs. It's nervous around pressure to spend more on defense. It's nervous around it's anxious around Trump administration and what it means, and it will take its cues. That where I would take my hope is, and where we have to build our power, our noise, our pressure, is that we're right. We've decarbonized the economy by 50% from since 1990, whilst the economy's grown by 75%. Like, we can do the economy and we can do climate. And we have to remember, and we cannot stop saying, that the public are on our side. And we do not have the conversation as we experience it in Westminster around what the British public think. It's quite far away from what the British public think. It's one of those classic sort of examples. And so our mission, I think, is to demonstrate that visibly, vocally, over the course of the coming years. And I think that's where that is where I get my hope that the public is still with us, and we have to activate that, demonstrate it, build it. And Green Alliance's role, I suppose, in that is trying to help people understand Westminster and sort of land those messages here. But it is impacting it. It is depressing, waking up to the latest thing that Trump tweeted. But I do think we've got a lot to work with, and now's the time to kind of organise together and show our vision.
No, thank you so much. Just to share that resource will be available on our website. So if anyone's more interested in looking at it. And just as a final thank you to Dave Powell as well, who did a huge part in thinking of and producing a lot of the research. So he's here with us in the attendees. So thank you, Dave, again. Chris, Powell, Pollard, if you have any last remarks before we wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'd say that it was really interesting speaking to two experts for this bit of work and trying to be asking them to be very succinct about what's important. And that's kind of backfired because things have moved so quickly since the end of November that you might think that the answers might be quite different now. But I guess my final thoughts is that things have moved really quick, but that's not to take away, as Chris said, from the slower but really meaningful, broad support for climate and climate action that we know is there now. It's really going to be hard, I think, to turn that around. Climate change isn't going away, and the impacts aren't, and people are aware of that, and we know that. So that people are, the public are on our side for that, and it's really important that we take that into account. And if you're thinking about how tough things are now, we're a group of people or a movement that's been in tough places before. You can't expect it all to be, even if we'd like it to be all in one direction in terms of the trajectory. That would be fantastic. There's always going to be ups and downs over time, and I think that knowing that, to echo Chris's point, that the public are broadly in agreement is a really good sort of starting point.
Excellent. Thank you so much for both of you for sharing your remarks today at this webinar. We hope to the attendees that you found this useful. You will receive an email from us with a recording of this webinar and resources sharing more about what we shared today. And you can also find it on our website and our social LinkedIn. So thank you so much. And we'll be in touch with all of you. Thank you.